There is one sound I still hear when I think about the day my family tried to erase me. It was not the judge's gavel. It was not my stepbrother's laugh. It was the soft click of a metal sample case closing on the table in front of me. That click told me the truth had finally arrived. My stepbrother, Lucas Mercer, stood beside his attorney in a packed county courtroom in eastern Tennessee, wearing a navy suit and the satisfied expression of a man who believed every difficult part was already over. My father was dead. The sale agreement for Mercer Precision Works was waiting for a signature. The bank wanted its money. The private equity buyers wanted the land, the machines, and the defense contracts, and Lucas wanted the court to declare that I had no authority to stop any of it. He looked at the judge, then turned just enough for the gallery to hear him. "She flies helicopters for the Army," he said. "That does not make her an engineer, and it sure does not make her an owner." A few relatives laughed behind him. I sat at the other table in my service uniform, my hands resting flat beside a worn leather notebook that had belonged to my father. I had spent more than 2 decades learning not to react when somebody mistook silence for weakness. On the deadline line, a careless reaction can cost lives. In a courtroom, it can cost the truth. Lucas kept talking. He told the court I had abandoned the family business. He said I had shown no interest in the factory for years. He said my objections were emotional, uninformed, and probably motivated by jealousy because he had stayed home while I had chosen a military career. My stepmother, Diane, nodded along as if each sentence had been rehearsed at her kitchen table. Then the judge opened a sealed document my father had left with the court. He read the first page twice. He looked at Lucas. He looked at me. Then he asked a question that drained every bit of color from my stepbrother's face. "Colonel Mercer," the judge said, "why does the United States patent record list you as the original inventor of the only product this company is legally allowed to sell to the Army?" No one laughed after that. Before I tell you what was inside that sealed file and why Lucas had been willing to risk the company, the workers, and even soldiers he had never met, I want you to think about the quietest person in your own family, the one everybody assumes they understand. If you have ever watched someone be dismissed because they did not advertise their worth, stay with me. What happened next was not about revenge. It was about what people reveal when they believe the truth is too far away to reach them. My name is Hannah Mercer. I was 49 years old when my father died, and I had served in the United States Army for 26 years. Most of my relatives described me as a helicopter pilot because that was the easiest version of my life for them to remember. It was not wrong. It was simply incomplete. I began as an aviation officer. I flew utility helicopters in weather that made the horizon disappear. I carried medical teams into places where roads no longer existed. I learned how a machine speaks before it fails, a change in vibration, a smell that does not belong, a warning light that flickers once and then behaves as if nothing happened. Later, I earned a graduate degree in materials engineering through an Army program and moved into aviation safety and test evaluation. My work became less visible and more serious. I investigated component failures. I reviewed maintenance records. I traced broken parts back through suppliers, heat lots, inspection stamps, and purchase orders. Sometimes the difference between an accident and a safe landing was a mark smaller than a thumbnail. My family knew almost none of that. At Christmas, Lucas would ask whether I still got to fly the big green helicopters. Diane would tell people I fixed Army equipment. An uncle once introduced me at a barbecue as our family mechanic in uniform. I never corrected them for long. Some misunderstandings are accidental. Others are chosen because the smaller version of you is more convenient for the people around you. The truth was that I had grown up inside Mercer Precision Works long before I wore a uniform. The factory sat beside an old rail spur outside the town of Bellwether, Tennessee. My grandfather had started it after returning from Korea with one lathe, one drill press, and more patience than money. My father, Walter Mercer, expanded it into a respected machine shop that produced specialized fasteners, bearing housings, and vibration control parts for agricultural equipment, and, eventually, military aviation subcontractors. When I was a child, the factory smelled like cutting oil, hot steel, and the coffee my father forgot to drink. I did homework in the inspection room while he checked tolerances under a lamp. He taught me how to read a micrometer before he taught me to drive. He used to hold up a finished part and say that metal had a memory. Treat it wrong and it would remember under pressure. My mother, Ellen, kept the books and managed payroll. She could calm an angry supplier, repair a broken time clock, and remember the birthday of every machinist's child. She died of ovarian cancer when I was 23, 6 months after I received my commission. My father was 51 then. Grief hollowed him out for a while. He kept the factory running, but the light in his office stayed on later and later. 4 years after my mother's death, he married Diane Crawford, a real estate agent from Knoxville who had a bright laugh and a talent for making any room feel like it had been waiting for her. Diane had a son from her first marriage. Lucas was 19 when our parents married. He was charming in the way some people are charming when they have never had to carry the full weight of their mistakes. He called my father Sir for the first year. By the third year, he called him Dad in front of customers and Walter when he was angry. At first, I tried to believe we might become a family. I was stationed far from home, but I called every Sunday. I sent gifts to Diane on Mother's Day, even though she was not my mother. I helped Lucas apply to business school after he dropped out of his first college. When my father offered him a job at the factory, I told myself it could be good for both of them. Lucas started in sales and moved upward quickly. Too quickly, according to some of the older employees. He liked large clients, public announcements, and photographs beside new machines. He did not like inspection reports, maintenance budgets, or any conversation that began with the words, "We need to slow down." My father and I were different. We rarely spoke about feelings directly, but we could spend 2 hours discussing a failed bearing and both understand that the conversation meant, "I miss you." The invention that later changed everything began after an Army helicopter made a hard landing during a training exercise in the mountains of North Carolina. No one was killed, but the investigation found that a locking assembly in the rotor control linkage had worn faster than predicted. The part had not broken. It had drifted outside tolerance under repeated vibration and heat. That distinction mattered. A broken part announces itself. A drifting part can keep working until the worst possible moment. I was a captain then, assigned to the safety review team. The Army issued corrective guidance, but I could not stop thinking about the design. During leave, I brought sketches home to my father. We spent 3 nights at the factory after everyone else had gone, testing alloys and changing the geometry of a locking collar no bigger than the first joint of my thumb. My father made the first prototype. I designed the internal relief pattern that allowed it to maintain tension through heat cycles without deforming. We tested it until dawn. He called it the Sentinel Collar. I told him the name sounded dramatic. He said anything that keeps a helicopter in the air has earned the right to be dramatic. The patent was filed under both our names. Because I was on active duty and the invention had potential military use, we followed every disclosure rule. The Army eventually approved a licensing path. Mercer Precision Works became the exclusive commercial manufacturer under a controlled agreement. The product did not make us rich overnight, but it changed the company. Orders grew. The factory hired more people. My father added a second inspection lab and paid off the mortgage on the building. Lucas knew the Sentinel collar was important. He did not know I had helped invent it. That may sound impossible, but families can hide obvious things in plain sight for years. The patent listed me as Hannah Ellen Cole because I was married briefly in my 30s and kept that name on professional records for a time. My relatives knew me as Hannah Mercer again after the divorce. Lucas never read the patent. Diane never asked why my father kept a framed drawing of the collar in his office with 2 signatures at the bottom. They saw what they expected to see. A daughter who left, a soldier who visited, a woman in a uniform who could not possibly understand the business decisions made by the men who stayed behind. My father never corrected them either. At the time, I thought he was avoiding conflict. Later, I learned he had another reason. About 6 years before his death, he created what he called the Safety Stewardship Trust. The trust held the patent rights, certain specialized tooling, and 1 unusual voting share in Mercer Precision Works. That single share had no power during ordinary operations. It activated only if the company attempted to sell the factory, transfer the patent, or alter approved materials without the written consent of the safety steward. I was the safety steward. The arrangement was not secret from the company lawyers or the bank. It was recorded properly. It was disclosed where the law required. But my father did not announce it at family dinners, and I did not use it to interfere with daily business. As long as the company followed its safety obligations, The share remained silent. My father called it a fire alarm behind glass. You do not pull it because you dislike the color of the walls, he told me. You pull it when smoke reaches the hallway. For years, there was no smoke. Then Lucas became president. My father remained chief executive, but a minor stroke weakened his left hand and changed the rhythm of his days. Lucas took over vendor negotiations, sales strategy, and financing. Diane encouraged it. She said Walter had earned the right to slow down. My father agreed more often than he argued, though I noticed he began calling me later at night. He would ask technical questions that seemed ordinary at first. How long should a material certification remain traceable? Whether a supplier could substitute one grade of steel for another if the tensile strength appeared similar? How much variation in surface treatment was acceptable before a full lot had to be rejected? I answered carefully. Then I asked why he wanted to know. Just keeping my mind sharp, he said. My father was a terrible liar when he was trying to protect someone. 3 months before he died, he mailed me his leather notebook. It arrived at my quarters in a plain box with no letter. The notebook contained old machine settings, phone numbers, sketches, and pages of figures written in his type block handwriting. Near the back, several pages had been cut out. I called him that night. Did you mean to send me this? Yes. Why are pages missing? Because the missing pages are somewhere safer. I waited. He said nothing else. Dad, what is going on? There was a long pause. Then he asked whether I remembered what metal does when it is mistreated. It remembers under pressure, I said. So do companies, he replied. That was the last serious conversation we had. 2 weeks later, I deployed with a review team to Germany after a maintenance incident grounded several aircraft. My father and I exchanged short messages. He told me not to worry. I told him I would be home by Thanksgiving. He died on a Thursday morning in early October. The official cause was a ruptured cerebral aneurysm. He collapsed in the factory parking lot before the first shift. By the time an ambulance reached the hospital, he was gone. I was standing in a hangar 6 time zones away when the chaplain found me. There are moments when military training is a mercy. Someone tells you the worst thing you can hear, and your body still knows how to stand, how to breathe, how to ask the necessary questions. Which hospital? Who identified him? Has someone contacted the funeral home? Does Diane have support? I completed those questions before I allowed myself to understand that I would never hear my father's voice again. I returned to Tennessee 2 days later. Lucas met me at the funeral home, hugged me for exactly as long as the people nearby could see, then whispered that we needed to avoid creating business confusion during a sensitive time. I had not mentioned the business. Diane wore a black dress and accepted condolences, like a woman moving through a receiving line she had prepared for. Her grief may have been real. I want to be fair about that. People can love someone and still become dangerous when fear enters the room. At the burial, Lucas gave the eulogy. He spoke about my father's vision for the company, his belief in local jobs, and the responsibility of the next generation to carry the work forward. He referred to himself 3 times as Walter's son. He mentioned me once. Hannah could not always be with us because of her army obligations, he said, but Dad was proud of her service. It was a kind sentence. It was also a boundary line. He was telling everyone where I belonged. Not here, not in the factory, not in the decisions that would follow. The morning after the funeral, I drove to Mercer Precision Works before sunrise. My badge no longer opened the side door. I tried it twice, then stood there listening to the familiar hum of the ventilation system behind a wall I had helped my father paint when I was 14. A security guard named Owen came from the front desk. I had known him since high school. He would not meet my eyes. "I am sorry, Colonel," he said. "Mr. Lucas changed the access list. When? Yesterday afternoon? My father had been buried less than 24 hours. I asked Owen to call Lucas. Lucas arrived 10 minutes later with Diane beside him. He did not look embarrassed. He looked inconvenienced. "This is exactly what I meant about confusion," he said. "We have customers calling and employees worried about their jobs. You cannot walk in wearing a uniform and start asking questions." I was not wearing a uniform. I had on jeans, boots, and my father's old canvas jacket. I told him I wanted to collect personal items from the office. My mother's payroll ledger. A framed photograph of the 3 of us at the county fair. The brass micrometer my grandfather carried home after the war. Diane folded her arms. "Those items are part of the business estate," she said. My mother's photograph is not a business asset. Everything in Walter's office must remain untouched until the lawyers finish their review. I looked through the glass doors behind them. Workers moved between machines, pretending not to watch. Then I noticed a red metal toolbox sitting beside the loading dock. It had belonged to my mother. The lid was bent. Rainwater pooled in the top tray. A roll of old payroll cards had turned gray at the edges, and the brass micrometer lay among rusted sockets like something discarded after a yard sale. I walked toward it. Lucas stepped in front of me. "We cleared out some obsolete material," he said. "You can take the box if you want it, but do it later. We have a buyer touring the facility this morning." A buyer. He realized his mistake as soon as the word left his mouth. "For what?" Diane answered before he could. "Nothing is final. Lucas has been exploring strategic options. My father had been dead 4 days. I picked up the toolbox. Water ran down my sleeve. I said nothing, because anger would have given them something simple to point at. On the drive back to my hotel, the toolbox rattled in the cargo area. Every turn made the loose micrometer strike the metal wall with a dull, measured tap. At a traffic light, I called Evelyn Grant. Evelyn had been outside counsel for Mercer Precision Works for nearly 15 years. She was 62, sharp-eyed, and known for correcting people without raising her voice. She had helped my father create the Safety Stewardship Trust. She answered on the second ring. "Hannah," she said, "I was wondering how long it would take." How long, what would take? "For Lucas to force your hand." I pulled into an empty church parking lot. "Tell me everything you know." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "Not over the phone. Meet me at my office in Knoxville. Bring the leather notebook Walter sent you." "How do you know about the notebook?" "Because I removed the pages." 2 hours later, I sat across from her in a conference room with no windows. The red toolbox rested by my chair, leaving a faint line of rust-colored water on the carpet. Evelyn placed a sealed envelope on the table. "Your father came to see me 6 weeks before he died," she said. "He believed Lucas had put the company in serious danger. He did not yet know whether it was fraud, incompetence, or both." She slid the envelope toward me. Inside were the missing pages from my father's notebook. The first page contained a list of purchase order numbers. The second listed dates, supplier names, and heat lock codes. The third had only one sentence. "Ask Hannah what blue dust means." I read it twice. Evelyn watched me. "Does it mean something?" "It might. Surface-treated aircraft components are often marked during inspection. Different shops use different identifiers, but at Mercer Precision Works, approved Sentinel collar stock received a thin blue witness coating before final machining. The coating was not decorative. Under ultraviolet light, it confirmed that the raw material had passed the required chemical and heat treatment verification. Blue dust in a cutting machine meant approved stock had been processed. No blue dust could mean nothing. Machines were cleaned, production lines changed. Or it could mean the shop was cutting unverified metal. I asked Evelyn about the buyer. "Redstone Meridian Partners," she said. "They sent a letter of intent 3 weeks before Walter died. The proposed purchase price is $38 million, but the structure is unusual. Most of the payment goes to retiring company debt and buying out Lucas's preferred shares. Very little remains for long-term operations." How much debt? Just over $11 million. That was impossible. The company had carried less than $3 million in ordinary debt the last time my father shared financial statements with me. Evelyn opened another file. Lucas expanded aggressively. New equipment, a second warehouse, a failed contract with a civilian drone company. Then he borrowed against receivables to cover losses. Walter discovered the full amount this summer, and Diane, she guaranteed part of the line using the house and 2 investment accounts. The sale was not about growth, it was an exit. If Redstone bought the company before the debt came due, Lucas and Diane could escape personal guarantees. If the deal failed, the bank could take the house, the investments, and possibly force the factory into liquidation. Their panic now had a number. $11 million. People behave differently when fear has a number. I asked whether Lucas knew about the safety share. "He knows a stewardship provision exists," Evelyn said. "He claims it is symbolic and that the sale can proceed with a simple majority vote. He does not know the full activation language because Walter kept that instrument in a separate trust file. That seemed reckless until Evelyn explained. Your father believed that if Lucas knew exactly what would trigger your authority, he would work around the trigger. Walter wanted honest conduct, not technical obedience, so he left a trap. A safeguard, Evelyn corrected. Traps punish. Safeguards prevent harm. What did he want me to do? Find out whether the company has changed approved materials. If it has, the stewardship share activates immediately. If Lucas also attempts to transfer the patent or sell the plant without your written approval, you gain full voting control until the breach is corrected. I looked at the purchase order list again. Why did Dad not tell me directly? Evelyn's expression softened. Because you were overseas, and because he knew what you would do. You would have left your assignment, come home, and confronted Lucas before Walter had proof. He wanted evidence, not a family argument. That sounded like my father. It also hurt more than I expected. I spent the next week separating grief from procedure. Grief wanted me to break the factory doors open and demand answers. Procedure told me to preserve records, identify witnesses, and never alert a subject before I understood the evidence. I began with public filings and documents available to me as the safety steward. The company had purchased certified nickel chromium steel from a supplier in Ohio for years. 8 months earlier, those orders decreased sharply. A new vendor called Cumberland Alloy Solutions began supplying material at nearly half the price. Cumberland Alloy had no manufacturing facility. Its registered address was a mailbox inside a shipping store outside Nashville. The company had been formed by a man named Derek Shaw, who happened to be Lucas's college roommate. That alone proved poor judgment, not fraud. I needed more. I called retired machinists. I spoke to former quality inspectors. I reviewed shipping manifests and compared them with production schedules. Most people were cautious. Bellwether was a small town. Mercer Precision Works paid good wages. Nobody wanted to be responsible for closing it. Then a woman named Rosa Alvarez called me from a blocked number. Rosa had worked in final inspection for 17 years. My mother had hired her. She asked to meet at a diner off the interstate, far enough from town that no one from the factory was likely to see us. She arrived carrying a grocery bag. Inside were 3 rejected Sentinel collars wrapped in shop towels. Lucas ordered us to pass them, she said. Why were they rejected? The hardness readings moved too much from piece to piece. The surface treatment also came off wrong. We stopped the line twice. Each time, Lucas brought in a consultant who said our equipment needed recalibration. Did it? No. The equipment was fine. She pushed one collar toward me. I turned it under the light. The witness coating looked blue, but too bright. I scraped the edge with the back of a spoon. Powder came away immediately. Real witness coating bonds during treatment. This was paint. My father had asked what blue dust meant because he suspected someone was creating the appearance of compliance. Rosa told me the quality manager, Ben Holloway, had objected. 2 days later, Lucas placed him on administrative leave for insubordination. Where is Ben now? At home. Scared. Of losing his job. Of being blamed. His electronic approval appears on the lot records, but he says somebody used his credentials after he was suspended. I took the parts to an independent laboratory in Chattanooga. I used my own money and submitted them through civilian channels to avoid any suggestion that I had used Army authority for a private dispute. The results came back 4 days later. The collars were made from a cheaper alloy commonly used in industrial pumps. It looked similar, it machined cleanly, it could even pass basic tensile tests, but under repeated heat and vibration, it developed microscopic cracks along the relief channels I had designed. The very feature that made the Sentinel collar stable when produced correctly became a failure point when produced with the wrong metal. I sat alone in my hotel room reading the report. For the first time since my father died, I felt afraid in a way grief had not prepared me for. Mercer Precision Works had shipped 6 lots after the supplier change. Some went to civilian customers. 2 went to a larger defense contractor that assembled control components for Army aircraft. I called the proper safety office the next morning and made a protected disclosure through established channels. I did not name Lucas as the criminal. I reported a material traceability concern and provided lot numbers. The affected components were quarantined before installation. That fact would matter later. No aircraft failed. No crew was hurt. The truth reached the machines before the machines reached the sky. But Lucas did not know that yet. He only knew that a customer had paused deliveries and requested additional certification. His response was not caution. it was acceleration. Redstone Meridian moved its proposed closing date forward. Lucas scheduled an emergency shareholder meeting. Diane began calling relatives, telling them I was using my military position to intimidate a grieving family. An aunt I had not heard from in 3 years left me a message saying my father would be ashamed of me for threatening the jobs he created. Lucas sent a longer message. You always hated that Dad trusted me with the company. You left. I stayed. You do not get to come home in a uniform and take what I built. I read it once and saved it. He had given me motive, fear, and a statement of entitlement in 3 sentences. What he had not given me was proof that he knowingly approved the substitute alloy. That proof came from the red toolbox. I finally emptied it on the floor of my hotel room. Beneath the rusted sockets and swollen payroll cards was a false bottom my mother had installed years earlier to hide spare cash for emergency payroll. The latch stuck, but the brass micrometer fit perfectly into a narrow slot at the edge. When I pressed it down, the panel lifted. Inside was a small flash drive sealed in a plastic bag. There was also a note in my father's handwriting. Hannah, if you found this, I ran out of time. The drive contained security camera footage from the inspection lab, copied during the final month of my father's life. In one recording, Lucas entered after midnight with Derek Shaw. They replaced boxes of material certificates in a locked cabinet. In another, Lucas stood beside the coding station while an employee sprayed blue paint onto unfinished stock. The final file was an audio recording from my father's office. Lucas's voice was unmistakable. We only need the numbers to hold until the sale, he said. Redstone will own the risk after closing, my father answered quietly. Risk does not change owners when a soldier is in the air. Lucas laughed. Hannah has filled your head with that army nonsense. These parts are overbuilt. Nobody will ever know the difference. My father said one more thing. She will. The recording ended there. I did not feel victorious. I felt sick. The central question was no longer whether Lucas had made a desperate business decision. He had known. He had understood the safety issue. He had chosen the sale because it would move the debt and the liability beyond his reach before anyone could stop him. His motive and his method were the same thing. He needed the company sold quickly because the defective material was the reason the company could not survive an honest review. Evelyn listened to the recordings in her office with both hands folded beneath her chin. When the final file ended, she did not speak for almost a minute. Then she said, "We have enough to stop the sale today." I knew what she meant. We could send the laboratory report, the recordings, and the trust documents to Redstone Meridian. Their attorneys would freeze the transaction before lunch. But stopping the sale was only one part of the problem. Lucas had already begun telling employees that I was the threat. If the deal collapsed quietly, he would blame me for the bank crisis, the lost buyer, and every layoff that followed. He would destroy records, pressure witnesses, and present himself as the son who had tried to save the factory from an absentee sister. I wanted the truth established where he could not rewrite it later. In court, I said. Evelyn looked at me over her glasses. That will be slower and uglier. It will also be public, preserved, and harder to bury. You understand that once we file, Lucas will attack your motives, your military service, and probably your relationship with Walter. He already has. She tapped the flash drive against the table. There is another issue. We should not reveal everything in the initial petition. If Lucas knows we have the video, he may create an explanation before he is under oath. That was the first moment I saw why my father trusted Evelyn. We filed a narrow petition seeking temporary control under the Safety Stewardship Trust and an order blocking the sale. We attached enough evidence to show urgency, but not the recordings. We included the independent laboratory report, purchasing discrepancies, and the trust provision stating that unauthorized material changes could activate the safety share. Lucas responded within 2 days. His attorney, Bradford Keene, filed a motion accusing me of interfering with corporate management based on incomplete information. He argued that the laboratory samples had no verified chain of custody. He described me as an active duty officer with no current operational role in the company and no practical experience managing a civilian manufacturer. He also claimed the stewardship share had never activated because Lucas had not knowingly changed approved material. That word mattered. Knowingly. Bradford had built their defense before he knew we possessed the sentence that destroyed it. We only need the numbers to hold until the sale. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. During those weeks, Lucas tried to make me disappear without ever touching me. He removed my photograph from the factory lobby. He sent employees a company-wide letter stating that an outside family member had made allegations that could endanger payroll. He told the local newspaper that military bureaucracy was threatening a multi-generational business. Diane hosted a dinner for relatives and asked them to sign a statement supporting Lucas as my father's chosen successor. Several did. My cousin Neil called me afterward. He sounded embarrassed, but not embarrassed enough to have refused dinner. "Hannah," he said, "people are saying you want to shut the place down and move production to an army contractor. That is false. Then why not tell everyone what you are doing? Because evidence does not become stronger when discussed over potato salad," he sighed. "You always do that. Do what? Talk like everybody else is too emotional to understand you." I looked at the wall of my temporary apartment. My father's patent drawing was taped above a folding table covered in financial records. "Maybe I learned to sound calm, because nobody listens when a woman in uniform sounds angry," I said. Neil had no answer. The next day, Ben Holloway agreed to meet us. Ben had managed quality control for 13 years. He was a careful man with thick hands and the exhausted look of someone who had spent too long deciding whether truth was worth the cost. He brought copies of emails he had printed before Lucas locked him out of the system. One email warned that Cumberland Alloy lacked required certifications. Another documented failed hardness tests. A third, sent directly to Lucas, stated that no Sentinel collars should ship until the source material was verified. Lucas replied with 6 words: "Release the lots. I accept responsibility." Ben stared at that message while Evelyn made copies. "I should have gone outside the company sooner," he said. "Why did you not? My wife is in treatment. Our insurance comes through the factory." Lucas knew that. There it was again. Fear with a number, a name, a hospital schedule. I told Ben the truth. "You should have reported it." But Lucas created the pressure, and he used your wife's illness as leverage. "Testify honestly now. Let the court decide the rest." He nodded, though his eyes filled. Before he left, he placed a small brass key on the table. "Walter gave me this the week before he died. It opens the old calibration cabinet in the second inspection room. He said you would know what to do with what was inside." We obtained a court order preserving the cabinet before Lucas could reach it. A neutral officer entered the factory with Evelyn and an independent locksmith. I stayed outside to avoid giving Lucas a photograph he could use. Inside the cabinet were original certified samples from every approved heat lot used during the previous 2 years. My father had labeled them by hand. Beside them sat substitution samples from Cumberland Alloy, along with dated test coupons showing progressive cracking after vibration cycles. He had built his own comparison study. He had also left a statement signed before a notary. "I suspect my son by marriage, Lucas Crawford Mercer, has authorized the use of unapproved material in the Sentinel collar production line. I have confronted him and ordered all affected lots held. If he proceeds with shipment or attempts sale of the company before full disclosure, he acts against my instructions, against the governing trust, and against the safety principles on which this company was built." My father had never legally adopted Lucas. He had allowed Lucas to use Mercer socially and professionally, but the statement used his full legal name. That detail told me how far trust had already broken between them. The bank provided another piece. A senior loan officer named Margaret Sloan agreed to comply with a subpoena. Her records showed that Lucas had drawn nearly $4 million from a revolving line of credit without my father's required second signature. He did it by submitting an amended corporate resolution that appeared to authorize him a loan. The signature attributed to my father was dated on a day he had been hospitalized after his stroke. Margaret had questioned it. Lucas assured her the document had been signed earlier and dated later by mistake. The money went to 3 places: a warehouse expansion, payments to Cumberland Alloy, and a consulting company owned by Derek Shaw's wife. More than $800,000 had passed through that consulting company without invoices describing real services. Evelyn warned me not to make the case larger than necessary. The court hearing concerned control of the company and the trust, not a full criminal trial. We needed to prove the activation conditions and protect the assets. Any fraud investigation could follow through the proper agencies. That discipline mattered. Revenge stories sound satisfying when every wrong is punished in one room. Real law is slower. Different questions belong to different authorities. A judge can stop a sale and remove a manager. A separate investigation determines whether someone committed a crime. I reminded myself of that whenever anger tempted me to imagine a single dramatic ending. 3 days before the hearing, Redstone Meridian sent Lucas a revised letter. The buyer would proceed only if the court confirmed his authority and if the defense customer lifted its quality hold. And Lucas now had no room left. He called me directly. It was the first time we had spoken since the factory door. "You need to withdraw the petition," he said. "No greeting, no question. Why? Because if this deal dies, the bank calls the note. People lose their jobs. Diane loses the house. Is that what you want? No. Then stop pretending this is about safety. Nobody was hurt. Nobody was hurt because the affected lots were found before installation." Silence. He had not known that. "You reported us to the army," he said. "I reported suspect components through the required safety channel. You used your position against your own family. I used a reporting system to protect flight crews from an unverified part." He lowered his voice. "Do you have any idea what Dad put me through? Every mistake, every bad quarter, he compared me to you. Hannah would have checked the numbers. Hannah would have asked the engineers. Hannah would never sign this. You were not even here, and I still had to compete with you every day." For the first time, I heard something under the anger. Not just greed. Humiliation. He had built his identity around winning my father's approval, and every debt made him more desperate to prove he deserved the company. The cheaper alloy increased margins. The quick sale would erase the failed expansion. The purchase price would make him look successful before anyone could examine how he got there. His motive was not money alone. It was the terror of being exposed as the man he feared my father already knew he was. "Lucas," I said, "Dad did not make you substitute material. You think you are better than me. No. I think you knew the risk and kept shipping." He breathed hard into the phone. "You cannot prove that." I looked at the flash drive beside me. I did not answer. He mistook my silence for uncertainty. "By the time this hearing ends," he said, "the whole town will know you tried to destroy your father's life work." Then he hung up. That night, I opened my father's leather notebook again. The final page contained a sketch I had overlooked. It showed the Sentinel collar in cross-section. Beside it, he had written a phrase from my childhood. "Precision is kindness when someone else's life depends on your work." I had heard him say it 100 times. For the first time, I understood that he had not been talking only about machining. He had been talking about truth. Truth should be precise, not inflated for revenge, not softened for comfort, not delayed until it becomes useless. The morning of the hearing, I put on my service uniform before dawn. I considered wearing a civilian suit. Evelyn said either would be appropriate. In the end, I chose the uniform because Lucas had spent years using it as proof that I did not belong in the factory. I wanted the court to see the whole person. He had divided into convenient pieces. Officer, engineer, daughter, inventor, safety steward. None of those identities canceled the others. Evelyn met me on the courthouse steps, carrying 2 cases. One held the legal files. The other held the certified material samples and the rejected collars. She looked at my ribbons, then at the old leather notebook in my hand. "Walter would have appreciated the symbolism," she said. "He would have complained that symbolism does not hold tolerance." She almost smiled. Inside, the courtroom filled early. Diane sat in the front row with my Aunt Marjorie, Cousin Neil, and several former suppliers who depended on Lucas. A local reporter occupied the aisle seat. Employees stood along the back wall because there were not enough benches. Lucas entered with Bradford Keene and Derek Shaw. Derek avoided looking at me. Lucas did not. He smiled as he passed our table. "Still playing soldier," he whispered. I looked at his suit jacket. A faint streak of bright blue dust marked the edge of his cuff. He had been in the coding room, maybe that morning, maybe the night before. Either way, he had carried the evidence into court on his own clothing. Judge Samuel Reddick entered at 9 o'clock. He was a broad-shouldered man in his late 60s with a calm face and a reputation for reading every page before a hearing. Bradford began with confidence. He described Mercer Precision Works as a healthy company facing temporary financing pressure. He called the Redstone sale responsible and necessary. He said my laboratory samples lacked reliable custody and that my concerns had been exaggerated by military caution that did not fit commercial reality. Then he turned toward me. Colonel Mercer has served her country honorably, he said. No one disputes that. But honorable service does not grant expertise in corporate finance, civilian manufacturing, or the daily management of a family business she chose to leave more than 2 decades ago. Lucas lowered his head as if the statement pained him. Bradford continued. My client remained here. My client worked beside Walter Mercer. My client carried the payroll burden, negotiated contracts, and accepted the risk of leadership while Colonel Mercer pursued a separate life. She now asks this court to reward distance with control. He presented family statements describing Lucas as my father's intended successor. Diane testified that Walter had trusted Lucas completely during his final years. She said my father never mentioned concerns about materials, never discussed a special voting share, and never suggested I had authority over the company. Then Bradford asked her what I knew about the Sentinel collar. Diane glanced at me. Hannah knew it was one of Walter's products, she said. I am sure he explained it in general terms. But she was not involved in the company. Not involved at all. Not that I ever saw. Bradford sat down as if the case had already closed around me. Judge Reddick sorted the documents before him. Mr. Keene, he said, your argument depends on Colonel Mercer being an outsider to the product, the trust, and the governing rights of the company. Is that accurate? Yes, Your Honor. And your client maintains that Walter Mercer alone created the Sentinel collar and that the company owns unrestricted rights to it. That is our understanding. The judge lifted one sheet of paper. Then, your understanding appears to have a serious problem. The judge looked directly at me. Colonel Mercer, would you stand? I rose. He held up the patent record. Are you the Hannah Ellen Cole identified here as co-inventor of the Sentinel vibration locking collar? Yes, Your Honor. A movement passed through the gallery like wind through dry grass. Diane turned toward Lucas. Lucas stared at the paper as if the judge had changed the words while reading them. Bradford stood quickly. Your Honor, we were not provided with any evidence that Colonel Mercer used a different surname professionally. You were provided with the patent number in the trust exhibits, the judge said. The public record identifies both inventors and includes assignment history. The court did not alter the record because counsel did not read it. Bradford sat down more slowly than he had stood. Judge Reddick continued. The patent was issued to Walter Mercer and Hannah Ellen Cole. Commercial manufacturing rights were then licensed to Mercer Precision Works under an agreement requiring approval from both inventors for any transfer. Walter Mercer's interests later moved into the Safety Stewardship Trust. Colonel Mercer's interests did not. He turned to Lucas. Mr. Mercer, you cannot sell unrestricted ownership of a patent right your company does not possess. Lucas leaned toward Bradford and whispered urgently. The first wall had fallen, but it was not the wall that frightened him most. Bradford recovered enough to argue that my inventor status did not give me corporate control. He was correct about that narrow point. A patent right could block the sale of the product line, but it did not automatically make me president of the company. The judge nodded. Which brings us to the stewardship share, he said. Evelyn placed the trust instrument on the evidence stand. The original bore my father's signature, my signature, Evelyn's witness seal, and the acknowledgement of the bank that had financed company operations at the time. Bradford objected that the activation language was vague. Judge Reddick read it aloud in plain terms. The share became controlling if company leadership knowingly approved an unverified material change in a safety-critical product, attempted to transfer the patent without the safety steward's consent, or concealed a reportable defect from a customer. Any one condition was enough. Lucas had triggered all three. Bradford attacked the first condition. There is no evidence my client knowingly approved an improper material change, he said. At most, there is a dispute among technical personnel regarding equivalent alloys. Evelyn opened the metal sample case. That was the click I still remember. She placed 3 objects on the table. An approved Sentinel collar, a rejected collar from Rosa Alvarez, and a cut section from the material preserved in my father's calibration cabinet. Dr. Miriam Cho, the independent laboratory director, testified by video. She explained the chemical composition, hardness variation, and vibration testing in language the courtroom could understand. The substitute alloy was not equivalent. It cracked sooner under the exact conditions the collar was designed to survive. Bradford asked whether any aircraft had crashed. Dr. Cho did not blink. The absence of a crash is not proof that a defective component is safe, she said. It is proof that the component was found before the wrong day arrived. That sentence changed the room. The employees at the back stopped shifting their feet. My relatives stopped looking at Lucas and began looking at the parts. Evelyn called Rosa. Rosa described the failed tests, the painted coating, and Lucas's order to release the lots. Bradford suggested she was angry over a denied promotion. Rosa reached into her purse and removed her original inspection stamp. "I worked for Walter Mercer 17 years, she said. "I brought my stamp because I want the court to understand something. My name is on safe parts. It is not on those parts. Somebody erased my rejection and replaced it with approval. That is not a promotion dispute. That is somebody borrowing my honesty without permission." Bradford had no useful response. Then Ben testified. He identified the emails warning Lucas to stop shipment. He confirmed that his electronic credentials had been used after his suspension. He admitted he had been afraid to report outside the company because Lucas had reminded him that his family's health insurance depended on cooperation. Lucas shook his head throughout the testimony. When Ben stepped down, Lucas whispered loud enough for me to hear, "Coward." Judge Reddick heard it too. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "you will remain silent unless called." The second wall fell. Bradford tried a different route. Even if mistakes occurred, he argued, Lucas had been trying to save the company from financial collapse. Removing him now would guarantee failure. The court should allow the Redstone sale, preserve jobs, and address quality claims after closing. That argument opens the door to the bank records. Margaret Sloan testified that the company debt exceeded $11 million. She explained the personal guarantees signed by Lucas and Diane. She described the amended resolution used to draw nearly $4 million without my father's second signature. Bradford objected when Evelyn asked about the date. The judge allowed the question. Margaret answered. The resolution stated that Walter Mercer signed it on the 14th of March. Hospital records show Mr. Mercer was admitted that entire day following a stroke and was unable to use his right hand. Diane covered her mouth. She turned to Lucas, not with anger at first, but disbelief. "You told me Walter signed before the hospital," she whispered. Lucas did not look at her. The personal guarantees had been Diane's reason for supporting the sale. She believed the debt came from ordinary expansion approved by her husband. She did not know about the questionable resolution, the consulting payments, or the substitute material. Her fear had been manipulated just as Ben's had. She was not innocent of everything. She had locked me out. She had repeated Lucas's lies. She had treated my father's belongings as obstacles. But in that moment, I saw that Lucas had built his plan by giving each person a different version of the truth. To Diane, the sale protected Walter's legacy and saved her home. To employees, it protected jobs from my interference. To relatives, it kept the company with the son who stayed. To Redstone, it offered a valuable patent and stable defense contracts. To himself, it promised one final chance to look successful. The third wall fell when Evelyn called Derek Shaw. Derek had arrived expecting to support Lucas, but after the bank testimony, his attorney advised him that loyalty had limits. He admitted Cumberland Alloy Solutions had no laboratory and no production facility. It bought low-cost industrial steel from a broker, repackaged certificates, and sold the material to Mercer Precision Works at a large markup. Who received the markup? Evelyn asked. Derek stared at Lucas. My company kept a portion. The rest went to Shoreline Strategy Group, owned by your wife. Yes. How much? A little over $800,000. Did Lucas know? Yes. Did Walter Mercer approve the arrangement? No. Lucas stood so fast his chair struck the floor. He is lying to save himself, he shouted. The deputy moved toward him. Judge Reddick ordered Lucas to sit. The calm in his voice had disappeared. Mr. Mercer, one more interruption and you will hear the remainder of this proceeding from a holding room. Lucas sat. His blue-marked cuff rested on the table. Evelyn saw it. She asked the judge for permission to photograph and preserve the residue. Bradford objected, but the judge noted that Lucas had voluntarily worn the garment into court and that the visible substance appeared relevant to testimony about painted witness coating. A deputy placed the jacket in an evidence bag. For the first time all morning, Lucas looked directly at me without anger. He looked afraid. Bradford requested a recess. Judge Reddick denied it until Evelyn completed the trust evidence. She placed my father's notarized statement before the court. The judge read it silently, then asked whether there was additional sealed material. Evelyn nodded. Walter left a video declaration with my office and a copy with the court clerk. It was to be opened only if company leadership challenged Hannah's authority after his death. A monitor was rolled into position. The clerk dimmed the lights. My father appeared on the screen wearing his gray work shirt. He sat in the inspection room, not his office. Behind him, through the window, the factory floor moved with the ordinary rhythm of a place that did not yet know it was being remembered. He looked thinner than he had admitted to me. He began without greeting. If this recording is being played, then I failed to resolve a problem while I was alive. He paused and looked down at his hands. I built Mercer Precision Works to provide honest work, not easy money. My father taught me that a machine can forgive a small error if the person operating it is willing to stop, measure, and correct. Pride is what turns a correctable error into a disaster. He explained the stewardship trust. He named me as the controlling safety steward if any activation condition occurred. He confirmed that I had co-invented the Sentinel collar and that my approval was required for any sale or transfer. Then he spoke about Lucas. I gave Lucas responsibility because I believed responsibility might teach him patience. Instead, I allowed his confidence to outrun his character. I saw the debts too late. I saw the material substitution later than I should have. That failure belongs partly to me. Lucas stared at the screen. My father continued, Lucas, if you are watching this, I want you to understand that I did not compare you to Hannah because I wanted you to become her. I asked you to check the numbers because numbers do not care who feels insulted. I asked you to listen to the engineers because machines do not respect authority. I asked you to slow down because speed is not courage when other people carry the risk. The room was completely still. Then my father looked into the camera in the way he used to look across the inspection table at me. Hannah, I am sorry I left you another problem to solve. You have spent your life protecting people who may never know your name. I should have told this family more clearly what you helped build here. I let your silence become a place where other people stored their assumptions. My throat tightened. He went on, the safety share belongs to you because you understand that control is not ownership. It is duty. If the company can be saved without sacrificing the workers, save it. If it cannot, protect them before you protect the Mercer name. A family name is not a moral achievement. What we do under pressure is. He reached off camera and placed my mother's brass micrometer on the table. Your mother used this to check the first payroll parts your grandfather ever made. She said precision was a form of kindness. She was right. Be precise now. The video ended. For several seconds, nobody moved. I had prepared for the patent record. I had prepared for the laboratory report, the bank testimony, and the recordings. I had not prepared to hear my father apologize. Lucas sat with his head lowered. Diane was crying openly. Ben covered his face with both hands. Rosa stood at the back beside other employees, one palm pressed against her chest. Judge Reddick called a short recess. As people rose, I remained seated. The courtroom blurred for a moment, not because I doubted the case, because my father had finally said the thing I had stopped expecting to hear. He saw me. He had always seen me. If you have ever spent years waiting for a parent, a spouse, or a family member to say that they understood what your quiet work cost you, then you know why that moment mattered more than winning. Tell someone while they can still hear you. Do not make them inherit the words after you are gone. When court resumed, Bradford's confidence was gone. He asked for permission to withdraw Lucas's opposition to my control and negotiate a temporary management arrangement. Evelyn looked at me. I shook my head once. Not because I wanted to humiliate Lucas, because temporary control would leave him access to records, employees, and customer communications. The risk was no longer theoretical. Judge Reddick agreed. He ruled that the Safety Stewardship Trust had activated when Lucas knowingly approved unverified material and concealed the defect. The attempted sale without my consent created a second independent trigger. The patent transfer language created a third. Effective immediately, the stewardship share carried controlling voting authority. Lucas was removed as president and barred from company premises except through counsel. The Redstone sale was enjoined. All electronic records, financial accounts, inventory, and quality files were placed under a preservation order. The judge appointed me interim executive steward for 180 days, subject to independent financial oversight. He authorized Evelyn to retain a restructuring specialist and required the bank to pause enforcement while a recovery plan was evaluated. Then he addressed the personal guarantees. Diane would not automatically lose her home. The guarantee's validity depended on whether she had signed based on material misrepresentations. That issue would be reviewed separately. Finally, the judge referred the questionable corporate resolution, hidden payments, altered quality records, and material substitution evidence to the appropriate state and federal authorities. He did not declare Lucas guilty of a crime. He did something more accurate. He preserved the evidence and sent each question to the institution responsible for answering it. That is how real accountability often begins. Not with a dramatic sentence, but with doors closing one by one around the lies. The gavel came down. The hearing was over. Lucas did not move. Employees began to leave in silence. My relatives avoided my eyes. The local reporter hurried into the hallway. Diane approached me before I could gather the files. Her face looked older than it had that morning. "I did not know," she said. "Which part?" She flinched, but I needed the question answered. The debt documents, the payments, the material, any of it. Lucas told me Walter approved the expansion. He said you wanted control because you resented him. You believed him because that version made me easier to dismiss. Tears ran down her cheeks. Yes, it was the first honest answer she had given me since my father died. I looked at the woman who had changed the locks, thrown out my mother's toolbox, and stood beside Lucas while he called me an outsider. I did not forgive her in that courtroom. Forgiveness is not a switch people deserve because the truth frightened them, but I told her something she did not expect. You can stay in the house while the guarantee is reviewed. I will not use the company vote to remove you. Dad wanted you protected, and I will honor that unless a court finds you participated knowingly. She stared at me. Why would you do that after what I did? Because control is duty, I said, not ownership. My father's words sounded different in my voice. Diane covered her mouth and nodded. Lucas finally stood. The deputy waited beside him. He looked at me with an expression I could not name. Hatred was there, shame too. But beneath both was the exhausted confusion of a man who had spent so long blaming other people's expectations that he no longer knew where his choices began. Dad never gave me a chance, he said. I answered quietly. He gave you a factory, a title, and his trust. A chance is not the same as protection from consequences. His jaw tightened. You always have the perfect answer. No, I said. I had 3 weeks to prepare that one. For the first time that day, Evelyn laughed. It was not a cruel laugh. It broke the pressure in the room just enough for me to breathe. The hard part began the next morning. Courtroom victories end when the judge leaves. Factories do not. At 6:30, I walked through the front doors of Mercer Precision Works with Evelyn, a restructuring specialist named Calvin Price, and an independent security team. Owen stood at the desk holding a new badge for me. His hands trembled when he gave it over. I am sorry about before, he said. You followed the access list you were given. I should have called you. Next time something feels wrong, ask one more question. He nodded. The factory floor had gone quiet. Nearly 200 employees waited between the machines. Some looked hopeful. Others looked at me as if I had brought the bank with me. I climbed onto the low platform my father used for safety meetings. I did not give them a speech about family legacy. They had heard enough speeches. I told them the truth. The company owed more than $11 million. Several customer payments were frozen. Production of the Sentinel collar would remain stopped until every material lot and inspection process was verified. Payroll for the next 2 weeks was secure. After that, survival depended on cooperation from the bank, customers, and every employee willing to rebuild trust. No one will be punished for reporting a problem, I said. No one will be ordered to sign work they did not inspect. And no shipment leaves this building because somebody is afraid of a deadline. Rosa stood near the inspection team. Ben stood beside her. One of the machinists raised his hand. Are you closing us? Not today. Are you selling us? Not to Redstone. What happens after 180 days? We earn an answer. That was all I could promise. We spent the first month counting everything. Inventory, debt, valid orders, rejected stock, lost customers, equipment that Lucas had purchased but never installed. Calvin found that the company was wounded, not dead. If the bank extended the loan and the defense customer restored the contract, Mercer Precision Works could survive by selling the unused warehouse, canceling the failed drone venture and cutting executive expenses that had grown quietly under Lucas. The executive expenses included a leased luxury vehicle, club memberships, travel billed as supplier development, and a renovation of Lucas's office that cost more than the annual wages of one machinist. We ended those first. I did not take a salary during the interim period. My army pay and savings covered my needs. Calvin insisted the company record the salary as deferred compensation so the books remained honest. Precision again. The independent audit identified every affected Sentinel caller. Most were still in inventory or quarantine. A small number had reached civilian systems, and we funded their replacement. No failures had occurred. The Army customer required new testing, new leadership certifications, and outside inspection for each production lot. It was expensive. It was also fair. Dr. Cho helped design the verification program. Rosa became acting director of quality, then returned as compliance manager after his wife's treatment stabilized. He spent his first week changing every approval credential and building a reporting channel no single executive could control. The blue witness coding was replaced with a more secure process that included a chemical marker and digital traceability. You could no longer create the appearance of approval with a can of paint. Derek Shaw cooperated with investigators. Cumberland Alloy closed. The funds routed through the consulting company were frozen pending litigation. Lucas was charged months later with several financial and records offenses. He eventually entered an agreement that required restitution and a prison sentence shorter than some people in town wanted and longer than he believed he deserved. I did not attend the sentencing. By then, I understood that watching him fall would not rebuild what he had damaged. Diane was not charged. Evidence showed she had signed guarantees and repeated false statements, but she had not known about the alloy substitution or hidden payments. The court released the house from part of the guarantee after finding that the bank documents given to her were materially incomplete. She sold it anyway. The place had become too full of arguments she could hear even when no one was speaking. She moved into a smaller home near her sister. Before leaving, she returned several boxes from my father's office. My mother's payroll ledger was inside. So was the county fair photograph. The frame had a crack across one corner. Diane apologized for the toolbox. I believed she meant it. Believing an apology is not the same as erasing the act. We began there and did not pretend it was farther. The bank extended the company loan after I agreed to a strict recovery plan. The defense customer restored limited production after the first verified lots passed every test. Civilian orders returned more slowly. The unused warehouse sold for enough to reduce the debt by nearly a third. Insurance and recovered funds covered another portion. We negotiated the rest. At the end of 180 days, Mercer Precision Works was still open. Judge Reddick reviewed the recovery report and made the stewardship control permanent until the debt fell below a defined threshold. I had no desire to run the company forever. My Army service was not finished, and the factory needed leadership rooted in daily operations rather than family inheritance. So I did something Lucas never expected, and some relatives called foolish. I transferred a large portion of the controlling equity into an employee ownership trust. The workers would earn shares over time. Major decisions would require an independent board that included employees, financial experts, and a safety representative. The Mercer family could no longer treat the factory like a throne passed from one favored child to another. Evelyn asked whether I was sure. My father told me to protect the workers before the name, I said. She signed the documents. Rosa became the first employee director. Calvin stayed as chief executive. I remained chair of the safety committee and retained my patent approval rights, but I returned to military duty. On the first anniversary of my father's death, the factory held a small ceremony in the inspection room. I almost did not attend. Ceremonies can turn complicated lives into simple stories, and my father deserved better than a polished version of what happened. But Rosa called me. There is something here you need to see, she said. When I arrived, employees had covered one wall with old photographs. My grandfather beside his first lathe, my mother handing out holiday checks, my father teaching apprentices, then holding the first fully recertified Sentinel collar after production resumed. At the center was a new brass plaque, the Ellen Mercer Precision Training Laboratory. I stood in front of it without speaking. Calvin handed me a folder, found behind a removable panel in my father's desk. Inside were architectural plans dated 2 years before his death. My father had planned to convert unused office space into a training laboratory for young machinists, veterans leaving military service, and local students who could not afford engineering school. He had already applied for grants. At the bottom of the proposal, he wrote that the laboratory would be named for my mother because she believed skill should never belong only to people who could pay to learn it. There was one more page. It was addressed to me. Hannah, if this project survives me, do not let them put my name on it. Your mother built the part of this company worth saving. I built machines. She built people. I read that line 3 times. Then I turned the page. I also owe you one truth I should have said sooner. You did not leave this family when you joined the army. You carried the best of it farther than I ever could. I was proud when you flew. I was proud when you studied. I was proud when you challenged me. I was even proud when you refused to let me call the first prototype good enough. There was a grease mark near the final paragraph. You may spend years believing you have to choose between service and home. You do not. Home is not the place where people keep you small enough to recognize. Home is the place where your full strength is useful. I lowered the letter. Around me stood machinists, inspectors, veterans, apprentices, and families. The factory was not healed completely. Trust does not regrow because a plaque goes on a wall. But the machines were running. The records were honest. Young trainees were measuring their first practice parts at benches my father had ordered before he died. Diane came to the ceremony. She stayed near the back until most people left. Then she approached the plaque and touched my mother's name with 2 fingers. Walter talked about this room, she said. I thought it was another project he would never finish. He finished the important part. She looked at me. Lucas writes to me. I waited. He asks about the factory. He still says the sentence was unfair. Some days he admits more than others. I hope he eventually tells himself the whole truth. Do you hate him? I considered the question. No, but I do not confuse the absence of hate with permission to return. Diane nodded as if she needed to hear that distinction. Before she left, she gave me a small object wrapped in cloth, my mother's brass micrometer. I had assumed it remained in evidence or was lost among the files. Diane said my father kept it in his nightstand after he recorded the video. He must have placed another one on the table for the camera, she said. He wanted this one saved for you. The metal was worn smooth where my mother's fingers had held it. I opened and closed the spindle. It moved with the same careful resistance I remembered from childhood. Inside the cloth was a final note from my father, for Hannah, who always checks twice. That was the warmest thing he could have written. Not because it sounded tender to anyone else, because it sounded exactly like him. I keep the micrometer on my desk now, not in a display case. Tools are meant to be used. Sometimes a young officer or engineer comes to me after a briefing and says they are tired of being underestimated. They ask when they should reveal what they know, when they should fight, when they should stay quiet. I never tell them silence is always strength. It is not. Silence can protect evidence, but it can also protect people who depend on your hesitation. My father waited too long to confront Lucas publicly. Ben waited too long to report outside the company. I waited years for my family to become curious about a life I rarely explained. What I tell them is this: do not announce your worth just to satisfy people committed to misunderstanding you. But do not hide the truth when someone else's safety depends on it. Know the difference. My family thought the uniform made me an outsider. They never understood that the uniform had taught me exactly how to protect what my father built, not the sign over the entrance, not the Mercer name, the standard behind the work. Lucas believed ownership meant the power to decide what everyone else had to accept. My father learned too late that authority without accountability is only risk wearing a title. And I learned that the strongest inheritance he left me was not the patent, the voting share, or even the factory. It was a sentence written beside a machine drawing in an old leather notebook. Precision is kindness when someone else's life depends on your work. That sentence saved a company. More important, it may have saved people who will never know how close a lie came to reaching the sky.